Probability sampling methods. When conducting a survey, it's important to remember that everyone of the target population must be considered. Exhaustive surveys are difficult to carry out in most circumstances. Therefore, when it's impossible to measure the whole population because of its size or geographic distribution, a probability sample is chosen. In probability sampling, each sampling unit in the population must have an equal chance of being part of the sample, and the selection of each sampling unit must be independent from selection of another one. This ensures that the selected subgroup is representative of the total population and would allow you to obtain a good estimate of the nutritional or mortality status of the entire population. There are three methods of probability sampling: simple random sampling, systematic random sampling, and the most frequently used, cluster sampling. This video will focus on cluster sampling and will address the household selection techniques to use within those clusters. In the field, you must use the same definition of household you have used when you calculated your sample size. If no definition is already determined by the government, then you can choose the most frequently used one, which is those who sleep in the same dwelling and eat from the same cooking pot. In this video, the term village has been used for convenience to designate an area where people live and that have a name given by local authorities or population. It may be a traditional village, part of a city, a sub-district, enumeration area, etc. Meeting with the village leader. When you arrive in the village, meet with the village chief or representative and explain the objectives of your survey. Good communication is very important at this stage. Make sure that the village leader understands everything that's involved in your methodology, particularly the concept of randomness. Explain how data will be collected and what data is collected. Remember that the village leader is really your partner in conducting the survey. Preliminary steps before starting household selection. Depending on the size of the village based on the established survey protocol, segmentation may be necessary before proceeding to household selection. If there are more than a given threshold of households in a village, say 250 households, segmentation would need to be undertaken. The following questions can be asked to the village leader in order to divide the village into segments. Are there major features of the village? Existing administrative subdivisions, natural barriers like river, road, or mountain, public places like markets, schools, churches, and mosques that divide the village. Once these landmarks are clearly sketched on a map, identify the different sections and ask your village leader to enumerate the households who live in each section. Then, you will obtain the number of segments and the approximate size of each. For example, one village can be divided into 3 segments. Segment A, between the river and main road, containing 120 households. Segment B, between the main road and the mountains, containing 100 households. Segment C, between the river and mountains, containing 180 households. To choose which segment will correspond to the cluster to sample, probability proportional to size, PPS, will be applied to ensure a representative sample. Place the segments into a table with the size of each in a separate column. See attached table as an example. In segment A, you will have households fall between 1 to 120. In segment B, households will fall between 121 to 220. In segment C, you will have households fall between 221 to 400. To determine the segment to be surveyed, first, a random number is selected between 1 and the sampling interval. The sampling interval is the total number of households in the village divided by the number of clusters assigned to this village. If one cluster is assigned to this large village, then the sampling interval is 400 divided by 1, so that sampling interval is equal to 400. A random start number is chosen between 1 and the sampling interval. In this case, it will be between 1 and 400. Using a random number table or smart software, a random number is chosen between 1 and 400. Say 245 is chosen. 245 falls between 221 and 400, so segment C is chosen. That is the area that will contain your cluster, which means that all of the households of that given cluster will be selected from only segment C, between the river and the mountains, using one of the household selection techniques. Household selection techniques. Depending on the survey protocol and survey manager, the household selection method, simple or systematic random sampling, or a combination of both, is predefined. Choice of method depends on what information you have in the field. Ideally, the same method should be used in each cluster. Simple random sampling requires a complete and recent list of basic sampling units. An existing list can be updated with a village leader to take account of any population movements or any casualties due to a recent shock. If there is no list, the preliminary step is to ask whether it's possible to make a list using the local knowledge. In many cases, by dividing the village into easily recognizable sections, local authorities may be able to create a list of all the households in each section and end up with an exhaustive list of the households in the village. Number each sampling unit, then pick every household or individual randomly using a random number table or via smart software, lottery method, and mobile applications. Systematic random sampling can be performed with or without a list of basic sampling units. If there is no list, dwellings must be organized in a defined geometric order, for example, camps or streets. Total number of households must be known. In this method, you have to calculate a sampling interval, n, such that every nth household will be part of your sample. Calculate the sampling interval n as seen previously for segmentation. For example, if you have to survey 10 households per cluster and the total number of households in today's village is 50, divide 50 by 10 and your sampling interval will be n is equal to 5. Therefore, you will interview 1 in every 5 households until you survey the 10 households needed. The last step consists of choosing randomly which household will be first to be included in your sample. To do this, choose randomly a number between 1 and n, that is, in our example, between 1 and 5. The number found is called a start random number. To do this, take separate pieces of paper and number them from 1 to n, in this case 5. Fold them in a way the numbers are not visible. Put them into a hat or a bag and ask somebody to pick one paper. The number written on your paper is then your start random number and corresponds to the first household to be included in your sample. Say, for example, that the number picked was 4. The first household to be surveyed in your cluster will be household 4. The second will be 4 plus 5 is equal to 9, 5 being the sampling interval you've calculated before, and the third household will be 9 plus 5 is equal to 14, and so on until you get the desired number of households, in this case 10. Those are the steps to take if there is an updated list of households in the village. Modified EPI method. Introduces proximity bias. Will only select households in one area of the village and always to the right of the first household selected. This method also gives too much control to the survey teams. Teams can spin the pen several times until their preferred route is found. For these reasons, SMART does not recommend using modified EPI to randomly select households. For more information about probability sampling, please visit the Capacity Building Toolbox and the sampling paper on the SMART website. www.smartmethodology.org